Okay. Cool. Okay, so yesterday we talked a little bit about the software development lifecycle, and I want to focus a little bit more specifically on one part of it that we're going to workshop together. So if I can get someone to help me here, let's have a look. Amira, if I asked you to explain to me your current understanding of software development lifecycle, what would you say at the moment?
What we did yesterday, so ideas and then requirements.
Yep.
And then the coding.
Yep. Ideas to requirements to coding, and then what happens?
The application.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. So some kind of process where we get that code and put it into a place where other people can interact with it.
Yeah.
Some kind of release, some kind of productionized environment. Cool. So pretty much you nailed it. It's essentially a conversion of like requirements into working software. And so in a nutshell, that would be like a thing you can say straight off the bat. Software development lifecycle is the process of getting requirements, needs from customers, from clients into working software. So there are a few stages to it, like we talked about yesterday, and Amiri just pointed out. We start with requirements. And there's a process to gather requirements, a bunch of like maybe user research, maybe problems that have cropped up, and we gather these into requirements. We could find a way to prioritize them, and this is all things that happen not within the software development process, but within other processes in the business. Some of you might already have experience with different parts of this, maybe in some jobs that you've had. But when it gets down to the software development lifecycle, we start with the requirements. And we go through a process, we try and look at these requirements, we convert them to something a little bit more granular, a little bit more atomic, and we call these user stories. And the clue's in the name, always framed in the perspective of a user, whoever's going to be interacting with it. Now, at the moment, all the stuff that we're writing, we don't really have any users. The users are ourselves, or really me at the moment, each other. If we think back to, where was it? This diagram up here, we're not redesigning any interfaces at the moment to any of the programs that we're writing. We'll get onto one of the modules where we start thinking about web interfaces and applications that live on another server somewhere else that people can interact with. But we're not designing web interfaces at the moment. We're just simply looking at how do we design software, how to design programs in an object-oriented way. And so we're focusing on this middle layer, the logic layer. So when we think about user stories, we're still going to use the idea of a user and thinking about how people are going to be interacting with it, but from the perspective of like someone who knows what they're doing, how to create objects, how to play around with our programs. So think of each other as users to your programs, or even me. So we start from requirements, and we're going to go through a process of extracting some user stories. From user stories, and I'll give an example in just a second about what like a typical user story is. There's lots of different formats for user stories, and we'll look at least one or two formats. From user stories, we then think about what our test-driven development cycles going to look like. So from user stories, we should go through a process where we take one at a time and go through some kind of TDD loop, where we take a user story and we write a failing test, we make it pass, and then we refactor. If we go through this process, we get to a point where we've got a bunch of working software, both test code and source code. And after this process, we need to go through some kind of manual testing or even automated testing, depending on what teams that you'll be in. So people sometimes call this QA, or sometimes it's called sort of staging environment, where you stage like you did with using Git. You stage work that's been changed for it to be tested. So this QA process can either be manual or automated. We're not going to worry about this until right at the very end of our course, where we go into sort of teamwork, some of this stuff here. And then we need to go through a release process into a production environment. So when everyone talks about software development lifecycle, it's the idea of going from requirements over here all the way to here and going through a process. And what we're focusing on at the moment is this here, this purple box for the moment. How do we do this? And trying to find a way to have an understandable process where we can look at some words, verbal requirements, and go through a process to convert that into code. So let's have a look at how we go from user stories to this part here. So this is the focus of this morning. All right, user stories to test cases. And what I've been, the name of this process, well, one way to talk about this process is to talk about the domain that we're working in and our model of it. Now, domain is a word that we use to describe anything in our problem space. So if you think back to some of the work that you've already done, you worked on the Scrabble challenge, and so that domain existed entirely of Scrabble, the letters, the points values, the Scrabble class, the methods involved, and that was its domain. All right, so when you modeled that domain, it was mostly modeled already for you. There was a Scrabble class and a score method, but sometimes you'll have, most of the times you'll have to create this domain model yourself. So domain is just simply the word that we use to describe the sort of problem space that we're working in, based on sort of the objects or the things that we're dealing with. So you also worked on the JS fundamentals exercise, that last challenge. You could describe that domain as being part of some encoding and decoding ciphers, dealing with string characters and letters and numbers and things like that. And some of you had some functions, some of you had some classes, and that was all part of that domain. So domains are concrete, and they are filled with usually business logic or business driven concepts. So when we model it, we're trying to find a way to, as with all models, represent it in some simpler way. So we have to find a way to take these user stories, understand them, and then model them in a way that we can use to write some tests and convert it into code. So domain modeling is this process where we take the user stories, which are the set of atomic parts of the requirements that we have to work with, and converting that into something that we can use. So let's have a look at this session, and I'm going to put it in your Discord channel. So we have two objectives. So make sure we understand the structure of a user story and be able to extract a domain model from user stories. Once we've extracted the domain model, then we can write tests. After we write tests, then we can write source code. And we've got to just essentially build up a process and have a rigorous process in how we do this. So here's an example of a user story. Quite simple, quite straightforward. It's a type of user story. It gives an indication of who's going to be using the application. It's going to be super simple at the moment. We're not trying to overcomplicate things. So I can find a specific cohort. I want to search a list of all cohorts by a cohort name. So let's take this and let's have a look at it. Copy this. Boom. So what I want you to start building up is when you go through user stories or you go through requirements, to start thinking about how can I represent this information in some kind of format that's closer to the code that you end up writing. And so it's this conversion process that we have to get to from English language, from verbs, from sentences. We have to find a way to represent this information in code. And this is usually some of the trickier parts of being a software engineer is how do you do that conversion? How do you represent? How do you model a problem domain? So a technique that you can use is to try and identify sort of nouns and verbs within the sentence and try and think about, are they going to represent some of the objects and methods that you need to use? So most of the time you can just ignore this first sentence for the moment. It just gives you an indication who's going to be using it. We don't have to worry about it. And most of the time the information will be captured in this last line here, in this specific format of a user story. Sometimes you get different kinds of stories. So what information is here? Well, if we try and think about what are the objects in here, or actually before we do that, let's do nouns and verbs, and you'll see that there's a correlation between objects and messages. So some things that jump out here, if you list them all, will be cohort, maybe cohort list, and some of the verbs here that might be important might be searching. Oh, I can't spell search. And maybe something to do with name. Who knows? If I have a look at this part here, clearly name is a noun, but it doesn't represent name as sort of part of cohort. We'll see how we can represent that a little bit later. So just by simple sort of disambiguation, a simple sort of clarification of like some of the things inside the sentence, we can get a sense maybe of some of the parts that we have to play around with and a way to represent some of this information. We have a cohort, we have a cohort list, so maybe we can go a little bit further and sort of say I want to search a list of cohorts by a cohort name. So maybe what I would like to do is say, okay, my cohort list is going to have this search method. I want to search the cohort list, and I want to be able to think about what it should do. So then I want to add, I'll put it over here. What should my cohort list search method do? And I want to rearrange it slightly so it's all in order. How do I do it over here? Let's move you down here. And let's move you a little bit further down. So if I have my cohort list as a noun, which represents like an object that I'll deal with, think of like an object as like a class. It'll have a cohort list class maybe, and it'll have a method inside of it to search. And what I want it to do maybe is to return like a cohort. So I'm already getting a sense of like the things that I want to happen by reading through this user story, pulling it apart, looking at the nouns and verbs. So maybe as a result, my cohort list has to have some data inside of it as a class. I want to think about what properties does it have. So let's add another column here in terms of properties that I want this cohort list to have. And maybe one way I can do this is to represent the list. So I want to have a list of cohorts, and it will be some kind of array that inside of it has individual cohorts. So I'm just jotting things down to sort of give a representation of what I'm trying to do. Maybe at some point, I can then use this to write my first test, where I would have a cohort list class. I would define a search method, and it would look through its list of cohorts and then return to me a cohort. A little bit of information is missing here. I want to search by cohort name. So I would have to provide some kind of information to my search method and say something like, I don't know, a name or a cohort name. And output a cohort. So again, I'm trying to use a very simple example to try and show like a process where we look through a story and try and represent it in some kind of way that we can look at what is my class going to be, what is the method that I need to define, what properties does my cohort list need to do its work, and what should it return? What's the output of the method? And after we've got to this stage, and it's important to make sure that we're clear on what the outputs are going to be, there's a little bit of decision making to happen here. Do I want it to just output always one cohort? Is the name going to be unique? There might there be a number of cohorts by the same name? All this information we can postpone for the moment. Let's just keep it simple for the first version. You might always want the output to be an array of any cohort by that name. That's fine. That's fine also. There's not usually any one right answer. There are always going to be models of the domain that will be easier to implement than others. And that's just a feeling that we have to get by doing lots of these domain models and then trying to convert them, trying to implement them in code. You won't really know how good your domain model is by yourself unless you implement it. If it's tricky, it's likely to be something you need to go back and improve. So if we go back to this example, what have I done here? So here I've did something similar. Objects, I wrote down a cohort and a cohort list. I'd like to know what each of the cohorts, so an object, for like a class cohort, will have its own name. And then the method here I described was search by cohort name. And this @ symbol, I've tried to give an indication of like what kind of JavaScript type do I want as an argument. So it will be a string, usually with some kind of cohort name. So imagine your cohort name will be a string MSE-2106-A. And then we made it a little bit more functional by adding in more data for each of the objects. So a cohort would have a name, and it would return its name as a string. The cohort list will have an array of cohorts, it would return one cohort. So this is where I want everyone to sort of get to focus on this workshop. And I want you to split up individually and have a go at doing the same thing, understanding this first part here, and then doing it again with these two user stories, and then we'll come back and compare. All right. So again, quite simple, quite straightforward, but try and use the same table format, thinking about what objects have you come up with as a result of looking through these user stories? What is the data inside of each of the object that you think is useful from the user stories? What are the methods that you want for each of the classes? And then what should each method return? You can give examples, or you can stick to the types using the @ symbol. Does that make sense, folks? Cool. Okay. Any
Sorry,
questions?
could you just link,
Yeah, I hear something.
could you link the URL on Discord?
Yeah, absolutely, not a problem. You'll see actually that it's it's already there.
Ed, have we got the whole morning to do this task, or are we going to meet before lunch?
We will meet again. So I'm going to give everyone about 45 minutes to get as far as you can with this, and then we'll gather back as a group to see how far we get, and then we'll probably spend a little bit more time on it, and then we'll wrap up the session. And the rest of the morning will be continue work with this, or get on with other work that you want to do.
Do we make up the cohort names, or is there a certain?
At the moment, just think about, you're not trying to implement anything for the first 45 minutes. So just think about the objects, the properties, the messages, and what you want each method to do. And if you think sometimes it is easier to think about like certain examples, make everything up. Yes. So what the outcome I'm looking for is a table like this that represents the information in these user stories. Cool.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you're asking us to like code this in, or just on a table, or just on paper write stuff down.
So the outcome I'm looking for is a table that like this that represents the information in these user stories. Does that help? Yeah.
Yep.
So the instructions are also here if you want to follow. So write down, as we're doing, the nouns and the verbs, draw a table, organize into objects and messages, think about properties and then the functions. And you can keep going with thinking about different ways to diagram the interactions here. And then we'll gather back and have a look. All right.